The first week of June 2024 has more than one important anniversary associated with it. This is the second one for this week. Today, on June 6, 1944, Allied forces were finally given the go order from American General Dwight D. Eisenhower to finally punch their way through the Atlantic Wall into Nazi-occupied Europe. No one was sure that day if the invasion would succeed. And Eisenhower actually prepared two statements to be released. One, if there was a success, and one if it was a total failure. And if it was the total failure, he accepted full responsibility for the catastrophe and said that the men that he led should not be blamed for what occurred. But luckily that day, they succeeded. Now, some of the information on this operation, which you should know already, the importance of June 6, 1944. But the invasion actually started on June 5th. As paratroopers boarded planes and gliders in England crossed the Channel to be the first ones into Europe. 23,400 paratroopers and glider troops landed in France around midnight. Many of those troops landed without equipment. They were already going in lightly armed, lightly equipped, lightly supplied compared to modern day paratroops. But as many of them jumped out the doors of their C-47s, and that wind caught them for the first time, as their parachutes were opening, their equipment failed because it had not been properly tested beforehand. Their weapons, their supplies, their gear fell off of their bodies and reached the ground before they did. And not necessarily anywhere nearby where that paratrooper landed. Luckily, enough paratroopers landed with their equipment on to cause chaos and allow those troops who landed without equipment time to find replacements. Now, those replacements could have been taken off of dead German soldiers, but more often than not, it was taken off of dead GIs. Soldiers who, for one reason or another, did not survive to see the dawn of that morning. At around 6:30 a.m. local time, that is when the German defenders in their bunkers on the Atlantic Wall looked out. And as the fog started to clear across the channel, they beheld a sight beyond comprehension. Over 5,000 ships of every size and every type spread for as far as they could see. Overhead, over 13,000 aircraft rocketed their way across the English Channel into France to hit targets on the wall and behind the wall. And soon, you had 160,000 Allied troops from 13 different nations were pushing their way through the surf on landing craft to hit the beaches designated Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Utah and Omaha were exclusively for the Americans. The other nations, primarily British Commonwealth troops, were responsible for gold, Juno, and sword. The battle that day was epic, beyond anything anyone had ever comprehended could ever occur up to that point. And at the end of that day, over 9,000 Allied troops were killed or wounded. But they had done what was thought to be the impossible. They had created a foothold through a prepared defense that the enemy had been working on for 4 years. They punched a hole through it and widened that hole with every hour that passed, eventually seeing over 1 million soldiers landed in France over the coming months to push the Nazis out of the countries that they had invaded, they had occupied, that they had been exploiting and oppressing for 4 years. So let's give these troops, not just the ones who died that day, but the ones who survived and are no longer with us. Let's give them a moment of silence before we continue on. I want to continue on because I want to bring up a few things. There are people in Europe and America nowadays who say that the wrong side won World War II. That it should have been the Nazis and the Japanese that won. Now, for those of you that believe that, I will point out that there is plenty of fictional works, books, movies, and even a few TV shows about what the world would be like. Some are more brutal than others. But I can guarantee you, if the Axis forces had won World War II, you would not have any of the freedoms that you have now. You would have no freedom of speech. You would have no freedom of assembly or of press. You would have no freedom to own a firearm if you're in the United States, even though it is restricted, but you wouldn't even have the freedom for that. And I would point out that many of these people who say that the Axis should have won, that the Nazis should have won on June 6th, many of them would not exist. Because contrary to what they believe, they would not be around because they would not pass the Aryan purity standards that were being pushed by the Nazis. This is not a Jewish conspiracy. This is a real thing. None of you that worship the Nazis in the United States or in Europe outside of Germany are pure-blooded German. None of you would be accepted into the movement that you praise with your every breath. None of you are true Aryans. Those of us that are full-blooded German, we do not support the Nazis. We do not support the racial purity standards because we've learned to accept what it leads to. It leads to death, subjugation, destruction, starvation, imprisonment, beatings, torture. That's what it leads to. It doesn't lead to some utopia. where the white man is the ruler of all. No. You got it completely wrong. According to those rules that the Nazi Party followed, only pure-blooded Germans, going back multiple generations, hundreds of years, were considered racially pure. Everyone else, you were an Untermensch. And depending on how diluted, impure your bloodline was, determined if you were sent to the camp or just taken to the side of a ditch and strangled, dumped inside because it wanted to save a bullet. Or if you were clothed in rags, marked as a prisoner, and worked to death in a slave factory, producing weapons for the Wehrmacht. None of you that praise Nazism, that believe that Adolf Hitler is the epitome of Aryan purity, which he is not. He did not even pass Aryan purity standards. He had a Jewish grandfather. His own father was the bastard child of a servant who was sleeping with her Jewish master. None of you would be the important person that you think you would be if the Nazis had won. So you should be glad that they lost that war. And they lost badly. You would not be here. You would not be alive if they had not. The few of you that would be alive because you were a higher class of Untermensch, you wouldn't be in your mom's apartment or the basement of your mom's house, watching the internet, seeing whatever you want, reading whatever you want. You would be in a prisoner's uniform, behind barbed wire, being worked to death every day, until you finally did succumb to starvation or your wounds from being beaten relentlessly, exhaustion from working 16 to 18-hour shifts in a factory 7 days a week with little to no food. You should be glad that those soldiers that landed on Normandy June 6 of 1944 succeeded. World War II was a fight against totalitarianism. It wasn't just the United States or Britain against Germany. It was the free peoples of the world against Germany. Unfortunately, the totalitarians here at home took advantage of those freedoms, perverted them, and put us in the situation where we are now. It is not our freedoms that put us in this spot. It was evil people who took advantage of those freedoms, took advantage of us, to try to set themselves up as the new masters. Soon enough here, we'll be taking care of that, won't we? But just like the soldiers waiting in Europe, or waiting in England, for getting that order to go over, enjoy the time you have. Enjoy the time with family and friends. Enjoy your freedom. Enjoy the ability to be able to go out. Find a pretty girl. Take her out to dinner. Maybe convince her to participate in some nocturnal activities or some 24-hour very vigorous activities, or be able to go out and have a drink with your friends. Enjoy whatever appetizer or meal you want during it, in whatever quantities you want. Be glad that you are not in a prison camp right now, not a slave of a totalitarian government, where your one meal every day is a extremely watery potato soup with little to nothing else in it. Be glad and thankful for the freedoms that you have, that were brought to you by those soldiers on June 6, 1944, who kicked their way into Fortress Europe to free the peoples of those nations from totalitarian occupation. Now, before I leave, I'll point out the DVDs I have there are just some that I could find quickly and easily from my collection. Obviously, Band of Brothers, which has episodes about the fighting in Normandy. Saving Private Ryan, which came out in the late 90s, which dealt with the Normandy invasion and has the most realistic invasion scenes you will ever see in any movie. The one below them is My Way, a Korean movie. It's about a Japanese soldier and a Korean conscript. They were sent to China to fight the Russians, captured by the Russians, put into a Soviet prison camp. Then the Soviets needed troops to fight the Germans, so they pulled all of them out of the gulag, put uniforms on them, gave them a rifle with a couple rounds of ammunition, and literally sent them to fight the Germans. And if they didn't fight, they were machine gunned if they turned around. Well, the two main characters were then captured by the Germans. And when they eventually realized that, hey, these are Japanese army veterans, they were then drafted into the Wehrmacht. And they were assigned to a unit on the Atlantic Wall. The rest of the stuff involved in that movie, you can find out for yourself. Other movies that I would recommend include The Longest Day with John Wayne. I would also recommend Ike Countdown to D-Day by Tom Selleck, where you see the anguish that Eisenhower went to in the weeks leading up to June 6th. The weight of the entire planet on him to make that decision that potentially could see the deaths of tens of thousands or over 100,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Take a little bit of time out of your day today before you go to bed tonight and watch a movie about the invasion of Normandy. And at the end of that movie, give thanks to those men who died that day, the ones that survived that day who are no longer with us, that they had the courage to do what needed to be done to fight totalitarianism. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the patriot and militia movements, for all my fellow patriots, for all my fellow conservatives, for all my fellow Americans who actually consider themselves Americans, and the free peoples of the world that are still willing to fight totalitarianism, Always remember, essayons. Let us try.